Okay, so we're back. So continuing on with the presentation, Chapter 6 in Survive and Thrive as a Physical Educator consists of motivating students, and understanding the three types of motivation is key to keep students engaged and willing to take risks. Those three types of motivation are intrinsic, so motivation due to students' innate enjoyment of learning new skills, extrinsic, where students perform a task to receive an outcome. So whether that be an external reward or or if you do prize box or something like that, that usually happens in K through 6. And then something that's more typical, which is a shame, is a motivation, which is when the student is basically going through the motions. That's something that we don't want in a physical education class because our goal is for them to maintain enrichment in physical education and prolong their interest in health and physical activity in the future. For chapter 7, it's diversity in education. I mentioned this was my favorite chapter in the book. So it talks about stereotypes and how that can display a lack of cultural understanding, and that our goal as educators is to steer away from self-fulfilling prophecies for student achievement. So we don't want to let our personal biases get in the way of how we think students will perform, because what will happen is they'll most likely perform in the way that we are believing, because that's how we're approaching the teaching. Um, Another thing is to examine personal diversity and self perceptions of other cultures. And lastly, it does mention culturally responsive teaching. So we must embrace the culture of our students uh, and be sensitive to their cultural identities. Sorry for those typos there. And this can inform our instruction. So it's very important for us to look at those commonalities and create gateways for our students to create more of an enriching experience when they're in our physical education classes. Chapter 8 is navigating the school as a workplace, so experiencing socialization, and PE teachers experience that through custodial orientation, because we have to figure out what our facilities look like, and we have to make sure that we're engaging with our custodial staff and getting the support that we need from them and showing our support of them as well on campus. Content, innovative, and role innovative. The 4 stages of development for a teacher or a physical educator are survival stage, and that's our induction. So striving to find support in the school, and that's from administrators or colleagues. Consolidation stage, which is building competence. It's where we're building competency in our content or our classroom. Renewal stage is when we're looking for new ideas to provide variety in instruction. Maturity stage is when we're focusing on insights, perspectives, and beliefs about teaching. Chapter 9 is about developing relationships with parents. I felt that this was very important too, because in PE, you don't really get a lot of um, parental support sometimes, because they don't believe that it's an academic subject and they don't really think that it's important. And this was expressed in this book as well. So it's important to establish positive relationships with parents early throughout the year. And you could do that by sending a friendly email introducing yourself, or as we learned in a classroom management class, that you could send out a letter welcoming parents and students to your classroom and letting them know what the class expectations are. Another thing is to establish and set up parent-teacher conferences or showcase nights to maintain relationships and communication with parents. The last chapter of this book was professional development. So it is important for educators and physical educators to enhance skills through professional development. It also talks about the many organizations and alliances for professional development in the physical education field. They also mentioned to create a professional development plan to serve as a guide to plot a course for professional development and create a portfolio to monitor our growth in our professional career. So as you can see, this book was mainly a template on how to establish yourself as an educator. It didn't necessarily give us any in-depth information on how to build our lessons or strive for literacy within physical education, which was a bit disappointing, but I will say that overall it was a very informative book and it was helpful. So next we're going to go over our planning rubric. While I didn't think that it was in depth in this book, a way for us to really relate this rubric of planning for developing competencies in physical education. And I'm looking at level 5 because that is the goal. So a candidate's plan for instruction build on each other and learning tasks that maximize opportunities to respond. So for me, in my book, this has to do with the section on assessments and making sure that we're planning for the year. So there's 2 chapters that deal with assessment and evaluation, and making sure that we're planning our units and lesson plans in succession of each other. So we want to make sure that when you're creating a unit plan, there's an overall learning objective, and we need to create the steps that are conducive for a proper learning environment for our students. And the way that we can also do that is by including daily assessments to make sure that we're assessing learning and making sure that it's authentic, and making sure that we can build on each of those lessons based on what we see our students learning.
And just to kind of add on to that, well, great. Well, I guess what I got out of from my book was assessments, which was done, I think, fairly well. One of the things I think was missing that tapped into this level 5 of rubric 1 was tapping into more of the affective domain that I didn't see a lot of. And that's something that the EdCPA is going to require of us, is to make sure that we're tapping into that affective domain. So the book didn't list many strategies that we as physical education teachers could use. I think it was great at maybe particularly tapping into the psychomotor domain and a little bit on that cognitive domain, but I just wish there was just a little bit more on the affective domain. So moving on to rubric number 4, identifying and supporting language demands. So how does the candidate identify and support language demands associated with a key physical education learning task? I'm going to let Tiffany tap on this because I think her book particularly talked about that a little bit more.
So in the chapter where it talks about diversity and cultural diversity, it mentions tapping into basically the funds of knowledge of our students and keeping reference to their cultures and how they communicate. So I'm stretching that out in making sure that I'm providing the language supports that are needed for each of these students to reach optimal communication skills in this class. We do have some sort of reflective assignments, but because physical education is mostly performance-based, we're having a lot of discourse in the class. So making sure that we're opening up those avenues for students to be able to actively have positive discourse with their classmates and peers about the subject matter is important. So making sure that we're creating scaffolds and differentiation within our lessons while we plan to support these language demands, and making sure that we're providing supports and visuals for our students to be able to discuss what we're learning. They should be able to explain the sequences that they're doing and understand the reasoning behind the actions that they're learning or the skill. So that's one way I can apply this rubric to physical education and what we have to do in our lesson planning in order to get more language supports for our students.
So a lot of what Tiffany kind of went over was spot on of what we're looking for in future texts. My book did not talk about this at all. And coming from a teaching class right now, where a lot of my students are from the Middle East and need a lot of language support, I would have liked a lot of strategies to use and to implement in my class. And then last but not least, we're going to be going over rubric number 14, which is analyzing students' language use and physical education learning. So how does the candidate analyze students' use of language to develop content understanding? Like Tiffany said before, our goal is to hit level 5, which is the candidate explains and provides evidence of language use and content learning for students with varied needs. Again, my book did not talk about this at all, unfortunately, but Tiffany's going to go ahead and talk a little bit about it.
So at the end of the day, I think for this, this really goes back to syntax in a physical education class. So we really want to make sure that students understand how to articulate and express the proper sequencing of a performance skill. So while most of our features are psychomotor and cognitive in nature in terms of what the learning objectives are, this really hits the head on that. That while we're teaching a biomechanical skill, we want the students to be able to express how to get from point A to point B within their motions.
And just to add on to that, like Tiffany was saying, a lot of our students, they're great, and we could develop those psychomotor skills where these students are coming out and they're physically doing it. But physical education has taken this shift where we want our students to be able to verbally express and communicate with their peers the academic language of the activity. So I think that's an important critical aspect of that. And can they most importantly communicate that not only to their peers, but to us as teachers as well.
And I think another feature of that too is really implementing self-reflection. And that was something that was in my book too, allotting for students to be able to reflect on what they're learning and be able to discuss what they're learning with us. So that's something that I implemented in my classes through pair shares or small group discussions where students have to identify what they learned, what they did well, and figure out what their goals are moving on in terms of a progression of a skill. So that is the majority of that is our presentation in whole. So we really thank you for your support. We thank you for learning and listening and taking the time to hear about the books that we read. I would suggest to maybe throw in an additional book out there if you have another physical educator in the credential program. But thank you.
Yeah, and just to add on, like Tiffany said, we actually have some great books on mine. So Professor Ginsberg, if you have any questions on books that you could potentially use next semester, we've learned a lot this semester. And we're looking forward to next semester and learning so much more from you. Have a great summer. Thank you.